Hello everybody, how are you going? And welcome to Two Economies with One Set of Flaws, a showcase between Australia and Canada and why things might not be as good as expected.
Australia and Canada are about 14,000 kilometres apart, but they have a lot in common. Both nations are a member of the Commonwealth of Nations, sharing a British colonial heritage, and their governments are similarly structured as federal states and constitutional monarchies. Both nations also manage the unique challenge of having relatively small populations spread across vast and inhospitable landscapes. What's particularly fascinating about their geography is that nearly 80% of Canada's population lives within 100 miles of the US border, while Australia sees a similar concentration of its population along the coastlines.
That is true, but funnily enough, I'm kind of seeing the opposites there, where Australia doesn't have any land borders, but the non-coastal areas of Australia have no population, where in Canada's case, it's the complete opposite, which definitely makes sense as all the coastline is in the north side of Canada, and that's just where, let's be honest, anyone wants to live. But it is funny how we are so condensed. I mean, I honestly can't imagine Australia. Like, if you snapped your fingers and put 40 million people here, that would be crazy. Let's send them all to Perth, hopefully, or the Northern Territory, because the big cities, they're already pretty big cities. I don't know if they could just cope with 50% more?
If Australia and Canada were one economy, they would be the world's fifth largest, bigger than India and just behind Japan. They both have similar levels of GDP per person, with Australia at around $63,000 and Canada at $58,000, when you consider how much you can buy with that money. In terms of economic structure, both countries exhibit striking similarities in primary production sectors such as manufacturing, mining, and agriculture. However, Australia leans more heavily on mining and less on manufacturing compared to Canada.
We don't make anything. I mean, that's just because of our location to China, really. We can just relatively cheaply send all of our minerals and everything over there just to be manufactured and then just ship them back. And apparently that's cheaper than just making steel and everything. Like, we basically have no industry anymore. However, I do want to come back to this graph because, I wasn't crazy. Germany is apparently in this graph slightly lower than Japan. And I don't get why that is. I mean, Australia is basically on Germany's heel. And then, of course, just the massive gap between the rest of them. But man, to be fifth in the world in front of India of 1.6 billion, that's pretty crazy.
If you look at how their stock markets have grown over the past 30 years, you'll see that they follow a similar path. That's because both countries' economies are highly dependent on exports of their rich natural resources around the planet. The strong correlation between the two is unsurprising. Back in the late 1800s, the gold rush made the town of Charters Towers in Queensland so wealthy that it even opened its own stock exchange. Now,
what?
over 100...
What? What do you mean? The town had its own stock exchange. How does that even work? What are you selling? Like, you can sell goods, but how do you turn that into stocks?
Now, over 100 years later, Queensland is feeling the effects of another mining boom coming to an end. The ups and downs of the mining industry are tough, but Australia has managed to stay strong through it all. At its peak, mining investment was so big it made up 9% of the country's GDP, especially when Australia was rushing to supply China with iron ore and coal, leading to a huge spike in profits. But when the demand and prices for these commodities dropped, mining companies stopped investing in big projects, which led to less spending and fewer jobs. Similar booms have occurred in Canada. In the 1950s, Canada witnessed the first significant oil boom in North America. For most of the past 30 years, rising investment in oil and gas has supported increases in crude oil production volumes and export values. Over time, as technology advanced and oil prices rose, the focus of investment in oil and gas projects shifted towards oil sands projects in Canada. However, since 2008, falling oil prices have put a damper on things, slowing down economic growth from Western Canada all the way to the central provinces.
That was a hell of a graph that we just saw. Canadian oil export values impacted by volatile world oil prices. Look at that in 2008. That's crazy of a spike. I mean, I guess it's not good for everyone, but as a country, if you're selling that, that's mind-boggling of a fall, going from 140 down to, 70? Literally half? That's wild. And to be fair, this graph really isn't that modern. It's at best going to 2018 maybe, and so realistically, you could see even if you could forecast out 5 years, some things are going on that could certainly make this entire graph look like a gigantic spike, as just the reliance on oil and gas just continues to diminish because of other things coming in. I mean, Australia is still going to be kind of supplying lithium and all those kind of elements, but still, oil and gas have certainly already seen their fair share of competition, call it that.
their worlds of business are near identical too. For example, Macquarie, an Australian company, is the biggest manager of infrastructure investments in the world, and Brookfield from Canada is right behind it. However, when you look at the biggest companies globally by revenue, according to Fortune, you'll see that 6 out of the top 10 are either American or Chinese, while the top Canadian firm, Brookfield Asset Management, is ranked only 117th, and top Australian firm BHP Group, a mining company, is ranked only 180th.
That's wild. Like, from an Australian sense, to hear that BHP is such a huge conglomerate company, whatever you want to be calling them, that they can kind of do whatever they want. They have so much money, and to be hearing that they are 180th in the world in revenue, not in, I guess, valuation. I guess that's going to be different, but what else do we have? Revenue percent change? Look at that, 17%. I mean, for goodness sake, look at the revenues and especially the profits. Just revenues of 71 billion and then profits of 31, call it, billion as well. But that is pretty insane when you compare it to, what was Walmart? 11, like, look at that. Profits is higher in BHP than it is in Walmart, but revenues is just insane. I mean, Aramco is just untouchable in that regard, and Amazon's crazy as well. But overall, BHP to be 180th and Brookfield to be the two, or Macquarie was in there, but for those two to be the biggest in the world, I never would have thought that.
This shows Canadian and Australian firms have forgotten how to compete. It also seems as though Canadian and Australian firms have forgotten how to compete. It also seems as the world's largest economy is a model of perfect competition. In Australia, the two largest supermarkets, Coles and Woolworths, control 59% of the grocery market. Over in Canada, Loblaws and Sobeys together sell 34% of all groceries, which...
Sure, I mean, I can't speak for Loblaws and Sobeys, but man, Coles and Woolies are in the firing line at the moment for some... Well, I don't know how they can do their marketing to get out of the public eye and negative light, because nobody is liking them. And I guess it's a worldwide thing in terms of cost of living, but man, when people see these guys' profits, they do not like them. And honestly, it feels like it could be 90%. I guess the numbers are apparently 59, but from what everyone always talks about, as much as people don't like them, as much as we might have Aldi and IGA and the odd farmers market, honestly, I wouldn't still be surprised if it was way higher than 59%.
Loblaws and Sobeys together sell 34% of all groceries, which is even more than what the top 4 grocery stores in the US sell combined.
Wow!
When it comes to banking, the 4 biggest banks in both Australia and Canada hold on to 3/4 of all the money deposited by people, while in the US, the top banks have less than half of that. And it's not just groceries and banks. In both countries, domestic aviation is a duopoly and telecoms a triopoly. The list goes on. If companies need to reach a certain scale to be economically viable, for instance, to afford necessary investments in computer systems, then a small economy may struggle to sustain more than a few players in various industries.
I mean, it makes sense because we just don't have the population, and I guess in that regard, maybe Australia with 40 million, even 100 million, whatever you want to be calling it, would be a different landscape. You would have so many more avenues for competition, unless you just have the big 2 and the big 3 and the big 4 really just kind of continuing their growth in that regard. But still, to hear those numbers that Walmart and all of those just massive names have nowhere near the percentage, that's wild. It really helps you put it into comparison, because let's say the USA has 15 times the population and 10 times the population of Australia and Canada relatively, but then they just don't have the percentage there. And it just shows. I mean, it does make me wonder about China and how they run all that, because I think that's a very different economic model overall, and so it wouldn't come under the perfect competition band. But how is it run in comparison? Where do people get the majority of their food from, as that's what they've been showcasing?
Notably, the Australian-Canadian national champions, particularly in groceries and banking, are significantly more profitable than their American counterparts.
Right.
Fittingly, Australia has produced a number of top surf clothing labels, just as Canada has developed a niche in parkas and other winter wear.
That's so niche.
And, of course, both are home to commodities giants. Canada boasts the world's 4th largest proven oil reserves, with massive reserves in Alberta's tar sands. Along with crude oil, Canada's major commodity exports include natural gas, coal and iron ore.
Yeah.
Australia dominates in coal and iron ore, and is also the biggest producer of lithium, the third largest producer of cobalt, and the fourth largest producer of rare earths.
And uranium, and so many other things as well. But my goodness, do we just have so many things on offer, which do allow the world to have so many different technologies that are positive. And my goodness, like, everything needs materials, so it's not a bad thing in that regard. However, it then just causes so many problems when you have these technologies that come along that are cheaper, better, more reliable, whatever it may be, but because the entire economy is underpinned by these good old reliables, so to say, nobody is willing to move forward because it could, well, kind of send the entire ship down, is what people are thinking.
By 2030, it aims to become a globally significant producer of processed critical minerals.
That's crazy.
But there's a flip side to this story. Both Australia and Canada are finding it tough because they rely a lot on sending their goods to bigger economies. Australia, for instance, is really tied into China. Since China is the second biggest economy in the world, it's a super important trading partner for Australia. A big chunk of what Australia sells abroad, like iron ore, coal and natural gas, goes to China to help power its huge manufacturing and energy needs. In 2023, these goods made up a big part of Australia's earnings from exports, which really shows how much Australia counts on China's business.
Of course.
In the same way, Canada's economy is really tied up with the United States. It's a big deal because the US is Canada's #1 trading partner, with trade between the two nations being a cornerstone of Canada's economic prosperity. A significant portion of Canada's exports, including automotive products, energy, and natural resources, are destined for the American market.
For the exact same reasons. And of course it makes sense, especially for Canada. Like, you're this big reserve that has thousands of kilometers of shared border that you can just easily transfer it all over to, where China, it's the most convenient, but it isn't convenient. We have to ship everything over there. Everything. We don't even have like a big pipeline or anything. Like, we don't really export that much pipeable stuff. I mean, there was a plan to be perhaps changing that in relation to Singapore, just piping, powering, whatever you want to be calling it, all the way over from a massive solar farm in the Northern Territory all the way to Singapore, which would have been crazy, being by far the biggest solar farm in the world. But it's being hit with a lot of drawbacks or permit problems and governmental things, which makes sense. It's a massive international project, but still, we are so directly linked that it's so difficult, where if you want to just become kind of a sole custodian of your own goods in a republic in terms of an economic sense, you kind of can't do it anymore. You're just these puppets of these big players, being especially 1 and 2. It's not like, it's not like Germany's trading with France or Poland or Switzerland. Like, they're big economies, but not that big. I mean, Germany's third, but it's what, a tenth of the USA or whatever it is. It was tiny in comparison. And I mean, to put it into perspective, Australia a couple of years ago had a major problem because I think it was lobsters and wine. China stopped taking Australia's lobsters and wine, or at least put a huge tariff on it, so they basically weren't taking it. And it was all over the news, and it was a major drama, and there was farmers, obviously, that were highly impacted by it, but it was a huge problem, let alone if we're actually talking about the goods and services, or the goods that we're actually majorly exporting, like iron and coal. That would just be completely crazy.
This trade dynamic underscores Canada's economic reliance on US demand, which directly impacts its employment, manufacturing, and overall economic growth. Moreover, the US represents a major source of direct investment in Canada, funding various sectors from manufacturing to technology, which further ties the economic fortunes of Canada to the policies and economic health of the United States. It's possible that what's happening reflects a situation known as the resource curse, which has caused problems like political unrest and slower growth in countries like Africa and South America that have lots of valuable resources. For Australia and Canada, though, it's more like their reliance on resources has made them less interested in developing industries that could compete worldwide. That might be why, apart from commodities and outdoor clothing, there aren't many big companies from Australia and Canada that have made it big globally. Their inks are particularly lacking at the cutting edge of technology. Products deemed high-tech by the World Bank, such as aerospace, computers, pharmaceuticals, scientific instruments and electrical machinery, represent more than 7% of the combined exports of OECD members, but only 4% for Canada and less than 2% for Australia.
Oh man, truly that is crazy. Overseas, well, not overseas, but overall average, you look at that all the way up there and then you see, wow, the US is actually quite low in comparison. I didn't expect that. But Canada and Australia, Australia is zero. Well, it's basically zero, but Canada's barely off it. But Australia might as well just be the bottom line. And that is wild, and it's not surprising at all. Like, everyone that lives here knows that we don't make anything. I mean, we're all right when it comes to food sometimes, but sometimes you go look and you go, we have so much ability to cultivate, like such a wide variety of environments that aren't impacted in the same way that Canada can be too cold in a lot of areas. Like, we have so much water around the coast generally, but so many cooler climates, tropical climates, and still we're importing some random nut or berry or banana or whatever it may be from all around the world. And then how is that the cheapest? And it's just ridiculous, let alone when you're actually talking about major manufacturing industries and you have all the resources to do it, but it's still cheaper than, like I said, just to ship it overseas. But I guess when we just put zero effort into anything, like in terms of developing an industry like that, because we're so reliant going, those guys will sort it out. That's what happens. And it's the sad case for Australia and Canada, and I guess other countries, from what they were saying. The resource curse, I've never heard of that before, but man, does it make a lot of sense. You are just bound by what you have, not what you can give.
According to the world's intellectual property indicators, patents granted per 10,000 people are a mere 5.9 in Canada and 6.7 in Australia, compared to 9.9 in America and 28.2 in South Korea.
Damn.
This doesn't mean that Australians and Canadians lack talent. In fact, they're quite skilled, as shown by their rankings in the World Talent Ranking, where Canada sits at 13th place and Australia at 18. They also have top-notch universities and some of the highest rates of tertiary education in the OECD.
Oh yeah.
The issue lies more in their innovation systems not getting enough support.
Yeah.
In both countries, spending on research and development is quite low, only around 1.7% and 1.8% of GDP for Canada and Australia respectively, compared to an OECD average of 2.7%. Moreover, the total investment in venture capital, which helps fund new businesses with big potential for growth, was just $8 billion in 2023 for Australia and Canada combined, and that's about half of what it was the previous year.
Oh man, how is it just falling that fast? None of it makes sense. It just feels like we're just not prioritizing anything. I mean, I do want to say that the Men from Mars, that's an Australian company. And so I don't know where this is. I don't know if it's international or if it's in Australia, but I can only imagine it would be in Australia. But I do know that they do international international projects as well. So in that regard, it's not like there aren't big companies that are sprinkled throughout the world. Like they said, we do have some talent. I don't know how you even kind of rank that, so to say, but we're not 200th, we're 18th and 13th respectively, and so that's not the worst. You know, Canada to be right behind the Germans. I mean, the Germans are kind of renowned in that regard, and so it's not that bad, but it just comes down to actually just executing on what you have, and we just clearly don't do it that well. I mean, I know that in Canada's case, a lot of Canadians, especially, you know, they were saying that they have high-end universities and all of that, and then they just get poached straight down to the USA with higher pays and higher promises and all those kind of things. And so why would people stay there? You can have the same life, basically, the same workplace, basically, but just get paid more. And people go, well, why not? And then in Australia's case, I guess we move maybe overseas as well.
On top of that, they're not very open to foreign investment, with strict rules, ownership limits, and other obstacles making it hard for foreigners to start businesses in these countries. However, both Australia and Canada are hotspots for immigration. Canada, especially, is notable among countries with high levels of immigration. Australia has maintained its annual immigration target at 160,000. Immigration plays a crucial role in their economies and their long-term success. Without it, both countries will age. Moreover, immigrants bring diversity, innovation, and a broad spectrum of skills, contributing to the labour market's expansion and the filling of critical skill gaps in various sectors, such as technology, healthcare, and engineering.
But then we have also just seen the direct negative effects of what that level of immigration can do. I mean, you need it, just like they said, to fight off an aging population and all those kind of things. But it really is a double-edged sword, as you need to be building the houses for people that currently live here, plus extras. And especially then when you only have a couple of cities to choose from, there isn't enough room for everyone to spread out like there is in the USA. Like, we have the landmass, but not the sparsity, or we have too much sparsity. it's just so difficult when you're trying to fit everyone in really high density areas, but no one can then afford anything.
Economically, immigrants not only increase the labour force, but also contribute to consumer demand for goods and services, stimulating economic activity. Also, immigration significantly impacts the housing markets in both Canada and Australia, contributing to increased demand and rising property prices in major urban centres. As two of the most popular destinations for immigrants, both countries have seen their populations grow substantially due to immigration, leading to heightened demand for housing. This demand drives up real estate prices, particularly in cities like Toronto and Vancouver in Canada, and Sydney and Melbourne in Australia, where the majority of immigrants settle. However,
wow, what is that prices? Are they USD? Are they local currencies? I mean, what at 1.12 for a house in Sydney? Like, how big are you saying Sydney? Are you saying that yellow circle? I mean, that's not exactly on Sydney, but still, to find a house for 1.12, I don't think this was that old. It's 6 months ago. So to find a house for 1.12, I mean, you could do it, but it's not going to be in the city of Sydney, so to say. If people are going to be like, oh, I live in Sydney, it's like, oh, I live on the outskirts of Sydney for 1.12, let alone Melbourne. I mean, Melbourne may be a little bit more doable, but again, on the outskirts of Melbourne. Vancouver, Toronto, I mean, I've looked at their prices. They're a little bit more tame in some places. It wasn't any London, but they do still struggle as well. I just wouldn't think that Vancouver and Toronto is higher than Sydney, because every other metric we've ever seen is proving that to be false.
However, Canada and Australia are not alone. House prices are high relative to incomes across the rich world. This chart shows the big divergence between home price growth and real disposable income in the two countries.
Whoa! Whoa! That's wild. Canada home price income, United States, right next door. Biggest trading partner, biggest brother, so to say. They're on par. I mean, 2010, call it 2009, was a little bit difficult, and then 2015 was easy. Back in the 1990s was Canada's only time that home price is under income? That's wild. Whereas you look at the US there and the graph looks ridiculous because Canada inflates it up to 300%, but for the majority of the time, home price is under income. Where, like I said, there's barely any time where home price is under income in Canada, let alone that massive spike.
The average home in Canada is now nearly $650,000 US, which is more than 9 times household income. This divergence isn't limited to Canada. Home prices have deviated from disposable income in a much larger fashion in other parts of the world, making the US look very cheap. Even though Australia and Canada share a lot in common, Australia seems to be doing better overall. They differ notably in 2 important economic areas, what economists call productivity performance over the long term and the growth of living standards. Productivity is a big deal because it shows how well a country's people can turn raw materials, hard work and ideas into useful stuff. Australia has been doing really well in both of these areas for a long time. Meanwhile, Canada, along with many other wealthy countries, have seen wages stagnant for decades. Right now, Australia is ahead of Canada by $4 when it comes to productivity, which means they produce more goods and services for every hour worked.
Okay, I was trying to just look at that. The UK is under everyone. Wow. Okay, I mean, the US is up there. That's how you get a GDP like they do. But that's wild. I mean, $4 before the graph actually came up was a little bit hard to comprehend. But $57 to $61 an hour. Output per hours worked, I guess, as you just round up the millions and billions of hours over the course of the year, that's going to add up to a lot of money. But I feel like we need a little bit more context to this entire graph. Like, what does China look like? What does Germany look like? What does all these other countries look like? As much as we can go, wow, look at the USA, to hear that Australia is doing better than Canada in those areas, where that is areas that people often feel like Australia doesn't do well in, at least locally, I don't know. That feels pretty wild. I don't even know how you even work that all out. Our world in data source. Fair enough. If that's even remotely true, we're all doomed.
Since 1990, Australia's income growth per person has been 0.5 percentage point higher on average compared to Canada. But when it comes to overall income growth, Australia has been beating Canada by 0.8 percentage points. These might seem like small differences, but they really stack up over time.
Sure.
For instance, the average income per person in Canada is around $58,000, while in Australia it's about $63,000. Australia benefited from extensive economic reforms beginning in the early 1980s and continuing through the 1990s, which opened up the economy to foreign trade and investment, deregulated markets for goods and financial services, privatized state-owned businesses, and introduced sweeping competition reforms. Put simply, the Australian economy has outperformed Canada because of investment. At least until very recently, Australia has sustained a much higher level of investment as a share of its economy. Investment spending is key to new innovations and technologies that drive productivity growth. Compared to Australians and Canadians, Americans are generally wealthier. However, there was a time when Australians and Canadians were actually doing better.
Interesting. I mean, coming back to that graph again, the entire last 30 seconds of what he's been saying kind of contradicts the rest of the entire video. As much as you can, I guess, pick a winner out of the two, you can hardly say that we're both winners. I mean, you go from 58 to 63, and yes, there was a time when Australia was lower, and now it's above, sure. But at the same time, you're so close that does it really matter? Especially when we consider that it's 63,000 compared to 58,000, which is definitely less than 10%. But I believe that Australia can be in many ways more than 10% more than Canada would be, especially, like I said, if you are trading with the USA, nice, direct, super close in a lot of ways link. Like even just your automotive and all of those kind of things. You look at some of the prices of cars in North America compared to Australia when we're importing them from the best case, maybe China. It's way different. Way different. There is no way that a car is only 10% more in Australia. You might be looking at a 70,000 USD, whatever we want to call it, car compared to a $120,000 car. It's almost double in some cases.
However, there was a time when Australians and Canadians were actually doing better. In the early 2000s, their economies boomed thanks to rising prices for commodities. At one point, around the early 2010s, their GDP per person even briefly surpassed that of the United States in terms of dollars. But their fortunes are closely linked to the demand for commodities, which can be really unpredictable in the long run.
Oh yeah.
Canada's heavy reliance on exporting oil and gas could face challenges due to efforts to reduce carbon emissions.
There we go.
On the other hand, Australia might fare better because it has large reserves of minerals like copper needed for the transition to greener technologies.
Copper, lithium, and
However,
sun.
Australia's economy could suffer from its dependence on selling commodities to China. In 2020, China started limiting imports of Australian coal, timber, and other goods, possibly in response to Australia's call for an investigation into the origins of COVID-19. Despite these restrictions, Australia managed surprisingly well, and they have since eased. However, if China's economic growth slows down in the long term, as many economists predict, it could hit Australia hard. While Australia and Canada's economic systems aren't about to collapse, their weaknesses in certain areas could cause problems down the line.
Yeah, there is many different discussions and paths that people can go down to be trying to see if things are going to be positive, negative, whatever you want to be calling it. But things that have been outlined in this video are not impossible. When you hear that China's growth is directly related to our growth, and you go, well, can they kind of keep up exponential growth forever? You would think not. For instance, when we hear about these mega corporations, mega housing development corporations in China going bankrupt. Like there's been 3 or 4 or 5 or whatever, however many in the last year. And so when you're just seeing cities that get built and then knocked down because there is nobody to live in them, it's crazy. They have such an excess of housing because they had so much growth in an impressive way. Like, there's no dismissing that it is not impressive. But when, like I said, you are under the foot of so many bigger brothers, be it the USA or China or Germany and Italy and all the Europe, whatever it may be, you can have problems. And so, of course, our economies are our own problem, so to say, and there are ways that you can change it. Like I said, you can export solar, you can export this, you can export that, if that's what you're truly going after. But maybe you just need a bit more of a complicated economy. But we can only wait and see and hope and vote for what we want and what we think's best as a populace. And hopefully we choose right, because otherwise we once were above the USA, and given where everyone's at, I don't know if we want to be under the USA anymore.